Some little typewriter, right? I'm going to write my name all over this town with it in big letters.
Hey, stop him, somebody!
Get out of my way, Johnny. I'm going to spit.
Welcome back to the GOAT, a Brian De Palma fan podcast. And I am very, very excited today to be joined by author Nat Segaloff. Nat, welcome.
Hello, Craig. Thanks very much. The laughing and the audio listeners won't have any way of knowing this. I have an Italian greyhound named Louis who insists on joining the podcast. So if you hear any barking, it is him and not I.
Yeah, it's funny. There are so many podcasts out there that have furry friend guest stars that we sometimes see and hear. Thankfully, mine are downstairs and behaving today.
Well, listen, if it wasn't for Louis during the pandemic, I probably would have French kissed a light socket.
So, Nat, I introduced you as author Nat Segaloff, and we are primarily here today to talk about a De Palma-related book you wrote. But before we get into that, one of the more interesting aspects of the book that I found was learning about your history in film and your journey from film publicity and journalism all the way to becoming the author that you are today. Do you want to sort of give us the little Cliff Notes version of how you got where you are today?
Well, I graduated a long time ago, and I went right into movie publicity because I'd been running the campus film program, and I got to know all the publicists in my town, which was Boston, because I wanted to tie in with them. And so I entered film publicity when a job opened. And after about 5 years, between Boston and New York and a little stint somewhere else, I guess, I got blackballed by my newspaper. So I had to find something else to do. So I became a producer and a critic in Boston. And then I moved out to California. So I've been doing that ever since. And when the industry stopped here, because I made the mistake of turning over 40, I started writing books.
Yeah, excellent. And the one we're going to be talking about today is Say Hello to My Little Friend, A Century of Scarface. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your career as a critic. And I believe you reference this in the book a little bit, but De Palma has always been a bit of a sort of critical target.
Pincushion.
Yeah, pincushion. That's exactly right. So do you have any sort of recollections of your time as a critic and particular movies or events? I know Scarface is one that was critically sort of attacked and really took a while to find its audience. But I was just curious, as a critic, and it seems like you were one of the De Palma defenders out there, if you had any just overall general thoughts about your time as a critic as it relates to covering the films of Brian De Palma.
My main criticisms of the record were written for the Boston Herald, which was a tabloid, and we like to call it Boston's alternative newspaper because they were conservative. I was the second string critic, and therefore I was never given the big pictures to do. So when I saw Scarface, it was just somebody who watched Scarface, not as the critic who'd have the ability to review it. I later did other films for CBS radio and local television. But as far as De Palma's works, I got to know him through Greetings and Hi Mom and Get to Know Your Rabbit in the early days before he was really, quote, Brian De Palma. And then I fortunately had him as one of my clients when he was doing the press appearances for Sisters, be that back in the early 70s. So I was kind of doing independent work for American International Pictures and having a great time. Because I knew who he was, but the older Boston press, and we're talking the traditional people, really had no sense of it. So I knew, first of all, that he was a great director of comedies and very political, neither of which his later films so overtly reveal. So I kind of got in a side door. They set him up from New York, and I was in Boston, and he arrived. I think he was wearing a safari jacket in those days, but I really don't remember. My mistake was that I was wearing a tie. The first thing Brian told me was, get rid of that awful tie. So we started doing our press appearances, and he was funny, he was charming, he was intensely interested in film, and he hadn't been bruised by the press yet. Unfortunately, it probably started with Sisters. One of the most interesting aspects of working with Brian, and he was so smart. He brought with him his production designs for his next film, which was The Phantom of the Fillmore.
Yeah.
I guess rights were involved with Bill Graham and he couldn't use that name and they changed it to Paradise. And he had this big, thick book of his storyboards. Not a single critic was interested in seeing it. He whipped it out during a press lunch and he showed it to people. Yes, 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 Brian, tell us all about working with Margot Kidder in Sisters. Okay. Well, there was a retired critic named Marjorie Adams, who for 52 years had been the doyen of the Boston Press Corps. She was the first journalism school graduate of the Boston Globe. Everybody loved her in Hollywood, but she would put you through hell in interviews. But then the interviews came out and you were God. I loved Marjorie. I was really into the older film critics. And I would go to her apartment occasionally, and we'd talk. She had hurt her knee. She couldn't leave the apartment, so I brought Brian around to her apartment, which was on Beacon Hill, where all the Adamses lived. She wasn't an Adams, but she acted like she was. And Marjorie's sitting on the couch. I'm sitting on one ottoman stool. Brian is sitting on the other one. And I like to think that I helped introduce Brian to the vagaries and the tactics of critics, because she, who hadn't seen the film because she couldn't get out of the house, as his sisters, kept on peppering him with the questions that she had given in the past to John Wayne and George Cukor and people like that. And Brian held up brilliantly. One of the odd parts of it was Marjorie, having hurt her knee, had her legs propped up. Marjorie liked to wear short skirts. And when she moved her legs in a particular angle, well, they grow a lot of coffee in Brazil. Brian kept his aplomb, and afterwards he kind of looked at me sideways. What was that all about? Well, the next person I brought up there to meet Marjorie was Ernest Borgnine, whom she knew. So it was a ritual, a stop. And it was one of those adventures. Brian was remarkably open to the press. Nobody would let Julie Solomon, I'm sure, do a book about them. The previous person who allowed it was John Huston, with Lillian Ross doing Picture, which was based on The Red Badge of Courage. Brian was insanely open to the press and at the same time insanely vulnerable.
Yeah.
I just have so much regard for him. And that's most of my Brian De Palma story, but the rest of it is lost in the mists of time.
Yeah. And thank you for that. And yet not to sidetrack ourselves too quick, but that book on the making of the Bonfire of the Vanities is really amazing. And I'm glad you sort of said that, De Palma gave her carte blanche basically to write the book that she wanted to write. And it's since been sort of retold in a podcast that she hosted that was really good. And it helped me, if nothing else, appreciate that movie. I'm not a fan of it, but it helped me appreciate things. And one thing I've always said about De Palma is I respect the fact that he takes big swings. And sometimes when you take big swings, you're going to miss.
Yeah, the Bonfire of the Vanities did not work, and it wasn't De Palma's fault. The fault was the film itself. And my explanation for that is the book was written by Thomas Wolfe, who has a distinctive writing style. But that's prose, and they did not find an adequate transition, or translation, if you will, to the screen. De Palma took it in an elegant visual manner, but it wasn't a visual manner that worked with the elegance of Wolfe's style. Phil Kaufman had the same problem with The Right Stuff. So he just really abandoned the tone of Wolfe's book and made his own movie, with several screenwriters contributing to it, of course. But De Palma took the big risks and still does. And he just has so much grace and aplomb that it's hard to really find another director who has his combination of gifts.
Yeah. So one thing you hit on was sort of being on the ground floor for De Palma's early films, those comedies, prior to Sisters and Phantom of the Paradise. And I'd like to see if you had any thoughts about, from a critical perspective and also as a viewer, if those early comedies informed how you viewed his films, knowing that he had that sort of level of comedy in him. I always talk about filmmakers that aren't sort of viewed as overtly comedic. De Palma's definitely one of them, and I'd rank him in with Kubrick, who I also think, his films have a comedy streak that sometimes isn't caught by audiences. I was just curious if that was something you were aware of as his more challenging films were coming out.
Well, I think De Palma, when you start in comedies and you have someone like Robert De Niro, who one doesn't suspect would be funny, I'll add to that in a moment, it's kind of unexpected. It's more of an attitude than punchlines. When you look at, for example, his film within a film, Be Black Baby, which is a dreadfully terrorizing moment, and yet it's funny, especially if you know what the Living Theater had done with Judith Messina and Julian Beck and their film of The Brig. And you see here's a counterpart to that, which is audience participation. There's no way I can explain it. It shows that De Palma is really riding a very thin line between comedy and tragedy, and that's what art is all about. He manages to do it. What was interesting, and I'm thinking about De Niro in those two movies. People forget that Robert De Niro worked with Brian De Palma early on.
Yeah.
And the thing of it was, he was rippingly funny in a very, very strange way. And so in 1975, I think it was, when De Niro was starring in the Neil Simon film Bogart Slept Here that Mike Nichols was directing, Nichols shut it down after a few days because he thought that De Niro wasn't funny. This was the actor who'd starred in comedies, and Nichols didn't work head-to-head with De Niro. So what De Palma got out of De Niro was something that even Mike Nichols couldn't. De Palma just has a really, really great reach. I'm going on and on here. I couldn't pretend to describe what his style is. I mean, look at Get to Know Your Rabbit, where he was totally screwed out of it. And yet, when it works, it works.
Yeah.
They couldn't destroy it.
Yeah. Well, that's why I wanted to do this podcast, Nat, because I really believe in my heart of hearts, and I wouldn't do a podcast and devote time to a podcast if I didn't believe in it, that there is no other filmmaker like Brian De Palma. And you know, a filmmaker that is able to pivot as much as he's pivoted, but also who's been able to make legitimate masterpieces in multiple genres, which, you know, there's directors that dabble in different genres, but, you know, they either get stuck in that genre or they make a serviceable movie, you know, that did the job that they were paid for, but isn't considered a classic to this day. I mean, it's amazing to me that we have a movie like Carrie, but at the same time, you know, 20 some odd years later, he's making one of the best movies of the 90s in Carlito's Way. And there's not a lot of filmmakers you can draw that line from.
He's given the chance to do a lot of films, and he's strong enough that he can do them the way he wants. At the same time, he's always had trouble with the censors because they think he takes it too far. I saw Dressed to Kill in an exhibitor screening before it was cut.
Yeah.
And to me, it was a perfectly integrated film. It was violent, but I didn't think it was too violent. Then they made him cut it. And of course, the story of the censorship of Scarface is, well, not only is it in the book, it's also one of those things where he finally told Marty Regman, well, hell, they're going to give us an X. Might as well just go for it.
Yeah.
But you think of it, just go for it is really what De Palma does in his other work, too.
Yeah. And the funny thing about censorship, and I think, you know, Paul Verhoeven sort of had this philosophy on RoboCop where they kept giving him a hard time, so the violence just got more and more overblown and it almost became cartoonish. And I think the opposite's true as well. Sometimes if you start cutting things too much, like that elevator scene in Dressed to Kill, it could become more terrifying and more horrific than if you just showed what De Palma wanted to show.
You're right. And I think there's something Hitchcocking about that, too.
Very much.
That is what you don't show, the audience is able to imagine in their minds. But if you had it as graphic as De Palma had the elevator scene in Dressed to Kill, you see exactly what you get and no more. He's controlling it, and it's important for us to have that information. If you make it more obscure, then the audience gets carried away emotionally, and you lose your rationality for what's supposed to happen in the context of the story.
Yeah. While we're talking about Hitchcock, I did want to ask you, because one of the more interesting things about De Palma, in my opinion, is a lot of people say he might have riffed on Hitchcock a little too much. I think a lot of criticism around Obsession, you know, just sort of being a remake of Vertigo. Vertigo is one of my favorite films. I'm not a huge fan of Obsession. But my point is, I think that, and I don't know if there's any contemporary opinions from Hitchcock while he was still alive when De Palma was operating, but in my opinion, it seems like De Palma is a natural extension of what Hitchcock was doing. You know, so less of just a Hitchcock riff and more of taking the sort of playbook that Hitchcock created and doing things that Hitchcock surely would have wanted to do had he lived long enough to make those kinds of films.
Well, 2 points. One, when Obsession was made, Vertigo had been out of release for several years. And so the audience wasn't compelled to make a comparison between them. I happen to like the film, but that's because I was friends with Cliff Robertson and I like anything Cliff was in, including Spider-Man. as far as this whole Hitchcock business, and I hate to use the word defense because I don't think De Palma needs defense, but I raise a point in my book that Hitchcock developed a vocabulary of cinema. And De Palma used that vocabulary as other directors have used. Criticizing him for looking in a few shots like Hitchcock is like criticizing Hemingway because he used the same English language that Faulkner used.
Yeah.
The vocabulary is there. Hitchcock perfected it. Wouldn't it be awful if De Palma didn't use the appropriate shots? I mean, Scorsese uses it too. Everybody does. Paul Thomas Anderson is also brilliant at that. But Brian was the first one out of the gate. And I guess he's the one who gets as many arrows as St. Sebastian for it.
Yeah. So before we pivot to talking about the book, I did want to get your opinion on, and Scarface is not a movie that was written by De Palma, but do you have an opinion on the strength or weakness of a film based on the fact on if it's a story and a screenplay that De Palma has developed as opposed to coming on as sort of just director?
You know, you write so much stuff that never gets produced. I wouldn't want to venture a foray into that area. I know that Blowout is one of my favorite De Palma films at the time, please note. And he wrote that, and you would know this more than I. I seem to recall that in Film Comment or another auteurist type magazine, didn't De Palma tell the story of the film before he wrote it? I don't know why this is in my mind. Or maybe it was Home Movies. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, you're ringing a bell there, and if I can find
I could not find it.
the history behind that, I'll include that in the show notes. But yeah.
But I don't know if he's any more wedded to his own stuff. He certainly gets more money for it. The reason Scarface was written by Oliver Stone was that Oliver Stone had been contracted by Martin Bregman and everybody else, and it's a long story. Yeah. Fortunately, I wrote about it, but he wanted to write a film that he wanted to get into directing, and the only job he could get was writing it. And I'm sure De Palma made many changes along the way. If you look at the comparisons of the scripts, as I did, you know, by the time a script gets to the production floor, people kind of forget how many hands were in it.
Yeah, it's just in sort of my fandom, Nat, I tend to weigh the De Palma films that he wrote differently than the ones that he sort of didn't write. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of Carlito's Way. I really think it's one of the best films of the 90s. And of course, he didn't write that. So I think there's merit in both. I did want to, we mentioned Oliver Stone, and I've said on this show before that I'm a huge Oliver Stone fan. I think he's a filmmaker that there's a point where I think he'll get a genuine reassessment. And I think his impact on filmmaking, especially in the early 90s, I think will be re-recognized. I truly feel that the run of films, probably starting with Platoon, that ended with, let's say, Any Given Sunday, I don't think there were other filmmakers that would have been as gutsy as Oliver Stone in the fact that he was using different media, different film formats. He was really, I think Oliver Stone doesn't get the credit, but he was really the first like sort of MTV filmmaker. And I truly feel that there'll be a reassessment of him at some point, and I can say I was there. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
No, I fully agree with you. In fact, I'd even go back as far as Salvador. And I think JFK is one of the miracle films ever made. It's
absolutely.
If it's a 3-hour film, you've got 2 hours and 45 minutes of exposition, and you don't get bored for 1 second. That's brilliant filmmaking. And Natural Born Killer is the same way.
Yeah.
But anyway.
And I truly think that he had a direct influence on a lot of a way that a lot of films looked after Natural Born Killers and JFK and even The Doors. So getting into the book, Say Hello to My Little Friend, a Century of Scarface. I really, really enjoyed reading the book. And the main reason was I loved the history behind really getting into that original Howard Hawks Scarface. The history behind it, the real life parallels, the development from the novel. When that project was sort of on the table for you, was the De Palma aspect of it part of the appeal?
Actually not. It was the entirety of the both films that appealed to me. I love the Howard Hawks Scarface, and that was the 1932 version. It's a bit pretentious for Hawks' work, but I don't care because Muni is so much fun in it. And also the script is terrific. I have an emotional bond with it because at the time I showed it when I was teaching at Boston University, you couldn't get copies. It was completely out of release. Howard Hughes owned it. And I'm proud to say that one evening I walked in a 16 millimeter purloined print of Scarface, ran it for everybody I could find, and then 2 hours later left the building forever. So there was a kind of a almost sensual feeling about Scarface that I carried for many years. Publishers seem to have a great affinity for movies that have a round number as an anniversary, 50 being preferred, 40 for Scarface being secondary in their minds, and that is what helped trigger the book with Kensington Citadel Publishers. But I always had liked Scarface, and it was an opportunity to talk not only about both films, but about violence in cinema and about gangsters and about De Palma. So they all kind of came together in one cauldron, and the publisher said yes, and I'm very happy they did.
Yeah, and again, I think if you're a fan of film in general, or either one of the Scarfaces, it's worth reading because it's really a logical sort of journey through the history of Scarface in cinema. One thing I did want to ask you about, Nat, is there's an interesting credit in the De Palma Scarface where they sort of acknowledge the work of Howard Hughes. Do you think in 2024, if they're making Scarface, if the writing credits for that movie would have been handled differently?
I don't know whether the Writers Guild was involved or whether licensing with the Suma Corporation and Universal had anything to do with it. They should have credited Howard Hawks. They should have credited Ben Hecht. They should have credited a lot of people, but I don't know if they were compelled to do it in some cases. Since the 1983 Scarface is a remake of the 1932 Scarface, it certainly uses the same structure, but it also refers to the Armitage Trail novel and then adds information from Sidney Lumet, Marty Bregman, and of course Oliver Stone and his escapades. So it's a kind of a hodgepodge that De Palma and his editors straightened out. I don't know what the rules are about crediting people. I would like to think that they would have credited everybody, but they didn't.
Yeah. I almost wonder, Nat, if it's more like I've always thought of Scarface as, sort of like you mentioned in the book, whereas you look at like The Thing from Another World and John Carpenter's The Thing, they're both sort of a different take on the same source material. And I guess, Scarface could be looked at that way. But one of the more interesting things in your book is you pointed out some of the direct similarities that both filmmakers made from the source material. Again, I think it's an excellent book. I enjoyed the heck out of reading it. And I did want to sort of give a little bit of time to talk about some of your other books, because I believe this year you had released a book devoted to the making of The Exorcist.
I've had so many books lately. COVID kept me at the typewriter, and it worked. Last year, I'm trying to remember now, when you write a book and then it goes through the production process, you forget when you wrote it. I wrote a book called The Exorcist Legacy, 50 Years of Fear, which was all about the various exorci, and it mentioned the new one. The paperback version is coming out next year because it'll have an additional chapter about Exorcist Believer, about which I'll write in the book. That was an exorcism for me because I was not only one of the publicists on the original Exorcist in 1973, but I'm also William Friedkin's biographer with Billy's permission and a 50-year friendship with him. So the book was very much a personal effort for me, as well as a chance to set all the records straight about The Exorcist. The new one, by the way, includes some information from Michael Blatty, who was the older son of William Peter Blatty.
Oh, wow.
So I think their credentials are pretty much in line on that one. I also have coming out this coming year, he says, in a shameless plug for his work, a book called The Rambo Report.
Yes.
Which is, of course, all about the Rambo films and novels and even the cartoon series. And it is written with the close cooperation and blessing of David Morrell, who wrote the original 1972 novel First Blood, which gave birth, of course, to Rambo. So that's at Kensington Citadel again, and I just sent him the approved galleys a couple of days ago. So the ball's in their court now.
Oh, that's excellent. And for those who don't know, prior to this podcast, I worked on a Sylvester Stallone themed podcast called Slycast. We did many episodes devoted to the Rambo series. And for an anniversary of Rambo 2, I had the pleasure and honor of sitting down and chatting with Mr. Morrell, who is an amazing podcast guest.
Oh, yeah.
And
wow.
After we got off the call, he sent me just a treasure trove of photos and articles related to First Blood Part 2. And I really enjoy talking with him, and I also really enjoy his novels. I think he's a great writer, and I'm really looking forward to that Rambo book. And one thing I got to say is that's quite an undertaking. There's a lot more films than the two Scarface films. So I'm curious to see how you tackle it.
Well, there's stuff in there that even David didn't know about. And of course, most of the people involved with the films are gone now. So I had to do an awful lot of research, and it was fun to write because the politics of it are what people talk about for Rambo and the violence. But in fact, it's really about a man who has PTSD.
Yes.
When I think about all the tens of thousands of American service workers, service men and women who have come back with that horrible, silent psychological problem, and how Rambo addresses it in strange ways. I was trying to be respectful of all of them in writing it, and perhaps it'll help people. I don't know. I wouldn't be that presumptuous, but it's really about adjusting from war and about maybe not fighting any.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. So I will include relevant links to all the books we talked about, and there's a lot more that we didn't talk about. But again, the De Palma-related book is Say Hello to My Little Friend, A Century of Scarface. And if you're a fan of this show, if you're a fan of Scarface, if you're a fan of film, it's definitely worth checking out. Nat, I know it took us a while to connect and schedule this sit down, but I'm so glad we did, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to chat again in the future.
I'm here, same time, same number, Craig. Thank you so much, and thank you if Ryan De Palma's listening. Thank you very much for the work you've done, and certainly for all of the fans who support you and support him. I'm very proud to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, and take care.